The wind howled through the rocky crevices, with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very mountains themselves, and somewhere deep within those frozen peaks, a woman's desperate cries echoed against stone walls as she faced the most terrifying moment of her life, completely alone. What happened next would not only save her and her newborn child, but would bridge two worlds in ways that would change an entire Cherokee community forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1834 had been unusually harsh in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, with early snows and bitter winds that warned of a winter more severe than any in recent memory. For 22-year-old Emily Patterson, the changing season brought more than just the promise of cold weather. It carried the weight of a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. Emily had been working as a schoolteacher in the small settlement of Millfield, a community of barely 300 souls nestled in a valley between towering peaks. She had arrived there 6 months earlier, carrying credentials from a teacher's college in Virginia and a letter of recommendation that spoke of her dedication and moral character. What the letter didn't mention, what no one in Millfield knew, was that Emily Patterson was running from a past that threatened to destroy not only her reputation, but her very survival. The truth was far more complicated than the respectable facade she had carefully constructed. Emily had been born Emily Catherine Henderson in the mill town of Asheville, the daughter of a factory worker who had died in an accident when she was 15. Her mother, overwhelmed by grief and poverty, had remarried within 6 months, a decision that would prove catastrophic for young Emily. Her stepfather, Thomas Garrett, was a man whose charming public persona masked a nature that grew increasingly violent behind closed doors. Emily's mother, Sarah, seemed to disappear into herself after the marriage, becoming a shadow of the woman who had once fought fiercely for her daughter's education and future. The household became a place of tension and fear, where Emily learned to walk quietly and make herself invisible. It was during her final year of schooling that Emily met Jonathan Wright, a young merchant's son who seemed to represent everything. She dreamed of escaping to kindness, education, a life beyond the suffocating confines of her stepfather's house. Jonathan was handsome in a quiet way, with gentle brown eyes and a manner that spoke of books and culture rather than the harsh realities of mill work. Their courtship was necessarily secret, conducted through stolen moments after church services and carefully orchestrated meetings in the town's small library. Jonathan spoke of marriage, of taking Emily away from Asheville to start fresh in a place where they could build a life together. Emily allowed herself to believe in this future, to imagine herself as Mrs. Jonathan Wright, respected and safe. But Jonathan Wright, for all his gentle manner and educated speech, was ultimately a coward. When Emily discovered she was carrying his child, when she approached him with the news that should have accelerated their wedding plans, he revealed the true nature of his character. He was already engaged, he told her with uncomfortable shifting, and averted eyes, to a merchant's daughter from Charlotte. The arrangement had been made by their families, and there was simply no way he could honor whatever understanding he and Emily might have had. The abandonment was complete and devastating. Emily found herself alone, pregnant, and facing social destruction in a community that would show no mercy to an unmarried woman in her condition. Her stepfather's reaction when he inevitably discovered her situation was swift and brutal. He gave her a choice that was no choice at all: disappear immediately and never return, or face public exposure and the kind of punishment that would likely kill both her and her unborn child. Emily chose disappearance. Using what little money she had saved from her work as a seamstress, she created a new identity for herself, complete with forged papers and a carefully constructed backstory. Emily Patterson, the widow of a teacher who had died in a fever epidemic, was born from desperation and sustained by necessity. The deception had worked for months in Millfield. Emily threw herself into her teaching duties with an intensity that impressed the school board and endeared her to the children. She was careful to wear dark colors appropriate to her supposed widowhood, spoke occasionally of her late husband with convincing sadness, and gradually built a reputation as a dedicated educator who had overcome personal tragedy. But as autumn deepened into the harsh early winter of 1834, Emily's carefully maintained facade was becoming impossible to sustain. Her condition was now obvious to anyone who looked closely, and she knew it was only a matter of time before questions would be asked that she couldn't answer. The story of a widow carrying her deceased husband's child might have been believable if she had arrived in Millfield pregnant, but her supposed widowhood predated her arrival by months. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, the sharp-eyed wife of the town's most prominent merchant and the unofficial moral authority of Millfield, had been watching Emily with increasing suspicion. The woman had a talent for ferreting out secrets and a reputation for destroying anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards of propriety. Emily had seen the way Mrs. Thornton's eyes lingered on her expanding waistline, the calculating look that suggested uncomfortable questions were forthcoming. The confrontation came on a grey November afternoon that seemed to press down on the valley like a physical weight. Emily was organizing her classroom after the children had been dismissed when Mrs. Thornton appeared in the doorway, her expression cold and determined. "Miss Patterson," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I believe we need to have a conversation about your circumstances." Emily's hands stilled on the paper she had been organizing, her heart beginning to race with the familiar panic that had haunted her since leaving Asheville. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Thornton." "Oh, I think you understand perfectly." Mrs. Thornton stepped into the classroom, closing the door behind her with deliberate precision. "You see, I've been corresponding with some acquaintances in Virginia, following up on the credentials you provided when you were hired." "Interesting. Thing about that teacher's college, they have no record of an Emily Patterson, widow or otherwise." The words hit Emily like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the protection she had built around herself. She fought to maintain her composure, but the walls were closing in with terrifying speed. "Furthermore," Mrs. Thornton continued, clearly enjoying her moment of power, "your supposed late husband seems to be quite the mystery. No death records, no family memories, nothing to substantiate your touching story of loss and devotion." Emily's legs felt weak, and she gripped the edge of her desk for support. "I don't know what you're implying, but—" "I'm not implying anything," Mrs. Thornton interrupted sharply. "I'm stating facts. You're an unmarried woman carrying a bastard child, and you've been deceiving this entire community with your lies. The question is what we're going to do about it." The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. Mrs. Thornton laid out Emily's options with the precision of someone who had clearly given the matter considerable thought. Emily could confess her deception publicly, submit to whatever punishment the community deemed appropriate, and hope for mercy. Or she could leave Millfield immediately, never to return, and trust that Mrs. Thornton would keep her secrets as long as she never saw Emily again. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide," Mrs. Thornton concluded, her tone suggesting the matter was already settled, "but I would suggest that leaving quietly would be healthier for everyone involved." Emily spent that night in her small rented room, staring out at the snow that had begun to fall with increasing intensity. The weather reports had been ominous for days, speaking of a storm system moving down from Canada that promised to bring unprecedented cold and snow to the region. The mountains were already treacherous, and travel was becoming dangerous for even experienced woodsmen. But Emily had no choice. She couldn't face the public humiliation and likely violence that would result from Mrs. Thornton's exposure of her secrets. She had heard what happened to women in her situation in communities like Millfield, the public shaming, the physical attacks, the complete social destruction that often led to death by exposure or starvation. As dawn broke grey and bitter over the snow-covered valley, Emily gathered her few possessions into a worn carpet bag and slipped out of Millfield before the town began to stir. She had no clear destination in mind, only the desperate need to put distance between herself and the ruin that threatened to consume her. The storm that had been building for days chose that morning to unleash its full fury. What had begun as gentle snowfall quickly became a blizzard that transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world of white chaos. Emily had hoped to reach the next settlement, a trading post called Cedar Falls that was supposed to be a day's walk through the mountain passes. Instead, she found herself stumbling through knee-deep snow, her visibility reduced to mere feet by the driving wind and ice. Her condition made the journey exponentially more difficult. The child she carried seemed to grow heavier with each step, and the cold penetrated her inadequate clothing with ruthless efficiency. Emily had dressed for discretion rather than warmth, and her dark wool coat, while respectable, was no match for the Arctic conditions that had descended on the mountains. By midday, Emily realized she was lost. The trail she had been following had disappeared beneath the accumulating snow, and the familiar landmarks that should have guided her way were hidden by the storm. Panic began to set in as she understood the gravity of her situation. She was alone in a blizzard, pregnant with limited supplies and no clear sense of direction. The first labor pain struck her like lightning, just as she was beginning to despair of finding any kind of shelter. Emily doubled over, clutching her swollen belly as waves of agony coursed through her body. The baby, as if sensing the crisis surrounding its mother, had chosen this moment to begin its entrance into the world. Emily's mind raced with terror as she realized what was happening. She was going into labor in the middle of a blizzard, miles from any help, with no knowledge of what to do and no one to turn to. The romantic novels she had read spoke of childbirth in vague, sanitized terms that bore no resemblance to the raw reality of pain and fear she was experiencing. Another contraction, stronger than the first, brought Emily to her knees in the snow. Through the driving wind and ice, she could make out the dark shape of a rocky outcropping ahead. It wasn't much, but it might provide some shelter from the worst of the storm. Summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, Emily forced herself to move toward the rocks. What she found was more than she had dared hope for, a cave opening large enough to provide genuine shelter from the wind and snow. The entrance was partially hidden by ice and accumulated snow, but inside, the cave stretched back into darkness, offering protection from the elements that were trying to kill her. Emily crawled into the cave just as another contraction seized her, this one so powerful that she couldn't suppress the scream that tore from her throat. The sound echoed off the stone walls, seeming to multiply and amplify until it filled the entire space with her anguish. She was alone, she was terrified, and she was about to give birth with no help, no knowledge, and no hope of survival. A storm raged outside, sealing her into this rocky tomb, where she would either bring new life into the world or die trying. Emily closed her eyes and tried to remember every prayer she had ever learned, every fragment of faith that might sustain her through what was to come. Somewhere in the darkness behind her, she thought she heard something, a sound that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely. But the next contraction swept away all other thoughts, leaving only the primal struggle of birth and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, she and her child would see another dawn. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The contractions came in relentless waves, each one more powerful than the last, as if Emily's body had decided that this frozen cave would be the battlefield where life would either triumph or surrender to the merciless elements. The storm outside howled like a living thing, its voice mixing with Emily's labored breathing to create a symphony of survival that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Emily had never felt so utterly alone in her life. The cave stretched back into impenetrable darkness, and she could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down above her, millions of tons of rock and earth that seemed to mirror the crushing responsibility of bringing a child into the world, without help, without knowledge, without hope. Her hands shook as she tried to arrange her few possessions, a thin blanket, her worn coat, the small amount of food she had packed, into something resembling a birthing place. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced or imagined. It started deep in her back, a grinding agony that spread through her entire body like wildfire, then peaked in waves that left her gasping and disoriented. Between contractions, she could think clearly enough to be terrified. She had no idea what she was supposed to do, how to help her baby enter the world safely, or even if what she was experiencing was normal. Emily's knowledge of childbirth came from whispered conversations between married women, fragments of information that had been carefully sanitized and edited for unmarried ears. She knew that women sometimes died in childbirth, that babies could be born too early or too late, that things could go wrong in ways that no one liked to discuss. But the mechanics of birth, the practical knowledge that might save her life and her child's, had been kept from her like a secret too dangerous for unmarried women to possess. As another contraction seized her, Emily pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the cave and tried to remember anything useful from her limited experience with animals. She had grown up in town, but she had spent summers with her grandmother on a small farm, and she had witnessed the birth of calves and foals. Animals seemed to know instinctively what to do, she remembered. They found quiet, safe places and trusted their bodies to complete the process that had been going on for millions of years. But Emily was not an animal guided by instinct. She was a terrified young woman who had been thrust into an impossible situation with no preparation and no support. Every sound from the depths of the cave made her heart race with fear. Every shadow cast by the dim light filtering through the cave entrance seemed to hide potential threats. She was vulnerable in the most fundamental way possible, completely dependent on forces beyond her control. The hours passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Emily lost track of time as the contractions grew stronger and more frequent. She could feel her baby moving, shifting position, fighting to be born into a world that seemed determined to kill them both. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, and the temperature in the cave was dropping as night approached, and the wind drove snow deeper into the mountain passes. Emily's water broke with a sudden rush that soaked through her already damp clothing and pooled on the cave floor. The sensation was startling and somehow final, as if her body had crossed a line from which there was no return. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, whether she knew what to do or not, whether she survived the process or not. She tried to remember prayers, fragments of scripture, anything that might provide comfort or guidance. But the words seemed to slip away from her like water, leaving her with nothing but the immediate reality of her body's struggle and the desperate need to help her child survive what was about to happen. The urge to push came suddenly and overwhelmingly, a force that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Emily bore down with everything she had, her entire world narrowing to this single purpose. She could feel the baby moving, descending, fighting to complete its journey from the warm safety of the womb into the cold, harsh world of the cave. Between bushes, Emily caught her breath and tried to prepare herself for what was coming. She had torn strips from her petticoat to use for cleaning the baby, though she wasn't sure if she was doing it right. She had no knife to cut the cord, no way to warm water, no clean blankets or proper supplies. Everything about this birth was improvised, desperate, and potentially fatal. But then in the midst of her darkest fears, Emily felt something shift. The baby's head crowned, and she could feel the small, perfect shape of her child beginning to emerge into the world. The sensation was indescribable. Pain and joy and terror and wonder all mixed together in an experience that seemed to transform her at the cellular level. With the next contraction, the baby's head emerged completely, and Emily could see her child for the first time. The baby was smaller than she had expected, with dark hair plastered to its tiny skull and features that seemed impossibly delicate and perfect. Emily reached down with trembling hands to support the small head, marveling at the softness of the skin and the reality of this new life she had created. One more push, and the baby slipped into the world completely, a tiny, perfect human being who immediately began crying with surprising strength. The sound of that first cry echoing off the cave walls was the most beautiful thing Emily had ever heard. Her child was alive, breathing, protesting its arrival into this cold, unwelcoming world with the vigor of someone who intended to survive. Emily pulled the baby up onto her chest, wrapping the tiny form in the strips of cloth she had prepared. The baby was so small, so fragile, that Emily was afraid to hold too tightly. But she could feel the strong heartbeat against her chest and the warmth of the small body that had been part of her for so many months. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "Welcome to the world." The baby was a girl, Emily realized as she cleaned her daughter with the limited supplies available. A perfect, beautiful daughter who had been born in a cave during a blizzard, under circumstances that should have been impossible to survive. Emily felt a surge of fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This tiny person was entirely dependent on her for survival, and Emily knew she would do anything, absolutely anything, to keep her daughter safe. But even as she marveled at her newborn child, Emily was acutely aware of how precarious their situation remained. The birth had been successful, but they were still trapped in a cave during a blizzard, with no food for Emily, no way to keep the baby warm, and no prospect of rescue. The umbilical cord still connected them, and Emily had no idea how to safely cut it. The afterbirth had not yet been delivered, and she could feel her body continuing to work toward that final stage of the process. The cold was becoming a serious problem. Emily's clothes were soaked with perspiration and birthing fluids, and the temperature in the cave was dropping rapidly as the storm outside intensified. The baby was shivering, despite being wrapped in cloth and held close to Emily's body. Without proper warmth and nutrition, they might survive the birth only to die of exposure in the hours that followed. Emily tried to think practically about their situation. She needed to get warmer and find a way to keep the baby warm. She needed to eat something to maintain her strength for nursing. She needed to figure out what to do about the umbilical cord and the afterbirth. And somehow she needed to find a way to signal for help or make her way to safety once the storm passed. But as she held her daughter close and listened to the storm raging outside, Emily felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She had done the impossible. She had given birth alone in the worst possible circumstances, and both she and her baby were alive. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they had already overcome the greatest obstacle. They had survived. The baby's cries gradually settled into the soft sounds of a newborn adjusting to life outside the womb. Emily could feel her daughter's tiny mouth seeking nourishment, and she awkwardly arranged her clothing to allow the baby to nurse. The sensation was foreign but wonderful, a physical connection that seemed to complete the process of birth and establish the bond that would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. As night fell and the storm continued to rage, Emily found herself drifting in and out of an exhausted sleep, her body recovering from the trauma of birth, while her mind remained alert to any threats to her child's safety. She was aware that they were still in danger, that survival was far from guaranteed, but she was also aware that they had already accomplished something miraculous. In the depths of the cave, shadows seemed to shift and move in ways that might have been tricks of the light, or might have been something else entirely. Emily found herself listening to sounds that could have been wind or could have been voices, watching darkness that could have been empty or could have been occupied. But with her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, Emily felt a strange confidence that somehow, against all odds, they were not entirely alone in their struggle for survival. The ancient cave had witnessed the birth of new life, and the mountains themselves seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next in this story of survival against impossible odds. Emily closed her eyes and held her daughter close, trusting in whatever forces had brought them safely through the night and hoping that dawn would bring the help they desperately needed. 20 miles south of the cave where Emily Patterson held her newborn daughter, another woman was experiencing her own crisis in the pre-dawn darkness. Ayana Kingfisher, whose Cherokee name meant eternal blossom, sat bolt upright in her bed, her heart racing from the vivid dream that had jolted her from sleep. At 63 years old, Ayana had served as her people's medicine woman for over 3 decades, and she had learned to trust the visions that came to her in the night. This one had been unlike any she had experienced before. In the dream, she had seen a white woman with dark hair giving birth alone in a cave, screaming in pain while snow and ice sealed her into the mountain. But more than the birth itself, Ayana had seen the threads of fate that surrounded this event, golden strands of possibility that connected this unknown woman to her own people in ways that would reshape the future of her tribe. The vision had been so powerful, so immediate, that Ayana could still smell the metallic scent of blood and hear the echoing cries of both mother and child. Ayana rose from her sleeping furs and moved quietly through her cabin, careful not to wake her adopted daughter, Morning Star, who slept peacefully near the dying fire. The Cherokee settlement of Deep Valley had been their home for 8 years now, ever since they had been forced to relocate from their ancestral lands in Georgia. Unlike many of their people who'd been driven westward on the brutal journey that would later be called the Trail of Tears, Ayana's small band had managed to establish themselves in these North Carolina mountains, finding acceptance among the few Cherokee communities that had been allowed to remain in the East. The settlement consisted of 15 families, nearly 80 people in total, who had banded together to preserve their traditional ways while adapting to the harsh realities of life in a world increasingly dominated by white settlers. They lived in a hidden valley, accessible only through narrow mountain passes, a location that provided both protection and isolation. The Cherokee here lived quietly, avoiding contact with the outside world whenever possible, trading only with a few trusted white merchants who could be relied upon to keep their location secret. Ayana held a position of enormous respect within this community. As a medicine woman, she was responsible for healing the sick, delivering babies, and serving as a spiritual guide for her people. But her gifts went beyond the traditional role of healer. Ayana possessed what her grandmother had called the far sight, the ability to see events before they happened, to understand connections that others missed, and to recognize the patterns that shaped destiny. The vision of the white woman had been particularly troubling because Ayana could sense that this event was connected to her own fate and the fate of her people. In her 63 years, she had learned that such powerful visions always demanded action. The spirits were showing her this scene for a reason, and she knew from experience that ignoring such signs could have catastrophic consequences. Ayana dressed quickly in her warmest clothing, a deerskin dress reinforced with rabbit fur, thick, moccasins that reached to her knees, and a heavy coat made from bear hide that had been blessed with protective ceremonies. She gathered her medicine bag, a leather pouch that contained herbs, healing stones, and the sacred objects she used in her work. If the spirits were calling her to help this unknown woman, she would need all her skill and knowledge. The storm outside was beginning to intensify, with wind that cut through even her heavy clothing and snow that stung her face like tiny knives. Most people would have considered travel in such conditions suicidal, but Ayana had spent her entire life in these mountains. She knew how to read the wind and snow, how to find shelter when needed, and how to navigate even in the worst weather. More importantly, she was not traveling alone. Ayana had learned long ago to trust in the guidance of her spirit helpers, the ancestral voices that had guided her people for generations. As she made her way through the storm, she could feel their presence around her, invisible but tangible, leading her toward whatever destiny awaited in the frozen peaks above. The journey took her through terrain that would have been challenging even in good weather. Ayana followed deer paths and ancient Cherokee trails that had been used for centuries, routes that were invisible to outsiders, but as familiar to her as the lines on her own hands. The storm provided cover for her movement, ensuring that no white settlers would be out to observe her passage through areas where Cherokee presence was officially forbidden. As she climbed higher into the mountains, Ayana found herself thinking about the strange path that had led her to this moment. She had been born in the old Cherokee territory in Georgia, in a time when her people still controlled vast areas of their ancestral homeland. Her childhood had been spent learning the traditional ways from her grandmother, a medicine woman whose reputation extended far beyond their immediate community. Ayana's gifts had manifested early. As a young girl, she had demonstrated an unusual ability to communicate with plants and animals, to sense illness before symptoms appeared, and to see the threads of connection that bound all living things together. Her grandmother had recognized these abilities and had begun training her in the sacred knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Cherokee healers. But Ayana's path had been complicated by the increasing pressure from white settlers and the U.S. government to force the Cherokee from their lands. She had married young to a warrior named Red Wolf who shared her commitment to preserving their traditional ways. Together, they had worked to protect their community from the growing threats that surrounded them. The marriage had been happy, but brief. Red Wolf had been killed in 1829 during a skirmish with soldiers who were attempting to forcibly remove Cherokee families from their homes. Ayana, then 37 years old, had found herself widowed with no children of her own. The loss had nearly destroyed her, but it had also strengthened her resolve to preserve what remained of her people's heritage. It was then that Morning Star had come into her life. The girl had been orphaned during the forced removals, her parents killed by disease and exposure during the brutal journey westward. Ayana had found the 8-year-old child half dead from starvation and had nursed her back to health. What had begun as an act of compassion had evolved into a deep maternal bond that had given both of them a reason to continue fighting for their people's survival. Now, as Ayana struggled through the blizzard toward whatever destiny awaited her, she thought about the responsibility she carried. She was one of the few remaining keepers of ancient knowledge, one of the last who could perform the ceremonies and healing rituals that had sustained her people for countless generations. The vision of the white woman felt significant, not just as a call to help someone in need, but as a potential turning point in the ongoing struggle to preserve Cherokee culture in a changing world. The storm seemed to be guiding her movement, driving her in a specific direction that felt both familiar and completely unknown. Ayanna had traveled these mountains extensively during her years of gathering medicinal plants and seeking vision sites, but the path she was following now was taking her into territory she had never explored. As she climbed higher, the wind began to carry sounds that seemed impossible in such weather. The faint echo of a woman's cries, barely audible above the howling of the storm. Ayanna's heart began to race as she realized that her vision was becoming reality. Somewhere ahead of her, the woman from her dream was giving birth in conditions that should have been fatal. The sounds grew stronger as Ayanna pushed forward, following what appeared to be an ancient stream bed that cut through the rocky terrain. The cries were coming from somewhere above her, echoing off stone walls in a way that suggested a cave or rocky shelter. Ayanna quickened her pace despite the treacherous footing, driven by the knowledge that time was running out for both mother and child. When she finally saw the cave entrance, partially hidden by snow and ice, Ayanna felt a surge of recognition that went beyond her earlier vision. This place was sacred to her people, one of the ancient birthing caves that Cherokee women had used for centuries when they needed to give birth away from their communities. The cave held the spiritual imprint of countless births, the accumulated power of generations of Cherokee mothers who had brought new life into the world within its protective walls. But now, a white woman was laboring within this sacred space, creating a connection between worlds that could change everything. Ayanna paused at the cave entrance, listening to the sounds of birth coming from within, and understanding that she was about to step into a moment that would define not just her own future, but the future of everyone she loved. The spirits had brought her here for a reason, and as she prepared to enter the cave, Ayanna offered a silent prayer to her ancestors for the wisdom to understand what they were asking of her and the strength to do whatever needed to be done. Ayanna Kingfisher stood at the mouth of the cave, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she listened to the sounds coming from within. The cries had quieted, replaced by the softer sounds of a mother speaking to her newborn child. But Ayanna's trained ear could detect something else, the shallow, rapid breathing of someone in shock, the subtle sounds of a body struggling to recover from trauma without proper care or warmth. The medicine woman knew she was about to enter a situation that would test every skill she had learned over 3 decades of healing. More than that, she was about to cross a threshold that would forever change the relationship between her people and the white world that had brought them so much suffering. The spirits had shown her this moment for a reason, and she understood that her next actions would ripple forward through generations. Ayanna softly called out in English, a language she had learned years ago from traders and missionaries, though she rarely had occasion to use it. "Hello, I am here to help. Do not be afraid." The response from within the cave was immediate, a sharp intake of breath followed by a woman's voice, weak but defiant. "Who's there? Stay away from us." Ayanna smiled grimly at the protective instinct she heard in those words. This was a mother who would fight to defend her child, even in her weakened state. That was good. It meant she had the will to survive. "What was coming? My name is Ayanna," she called back, slowly moving closer to the cave entrance. "I am a healer. I saw in a vision that you needed help. I have come through the storm to find you." There was a long pause, and Ayanna could almost feel the white woman's mind working, weighing desperation against fear of the unknown. Finally, the voice came again, barely above a whisper. Are you Indian?" "I am Cherokee," Ayanna replied simply. "And you are giving birth alone in a sacred cave during the worst blizzard in years. The spirits have sent me to help you and your child survive." Another pause, longer this time. Then, please, my baby, she's so cold. I don't know what to do. Ayana stepped into the cave, her eyes quickly adjusting to the dim light. What she saw made her heart clench with both pity and admiration. The white woman was younger than she had expected, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair plastered to her pale face and exhausted eyes that still held fierce determination. She was holding a tiny bundle against her chest, and Ayana could see the baby's small face, blue-tinged with cold, but unmistakably alive. The scene was one of desperate improvisation. The woman had used strips of cloth to clean the baby and herself, had arranged her meager possessions to create some semblance of warmth and comfort. The umbilical cord had been torn rather than cut, creating a ragged wound that needed immediate attention. Blood soaked the woman's clothing and pooled on the cave floor, and Ayana could see the telltale signs of shock beginning to set in. But what struck Ayana most powerfully was the location itself. This cave held deep spiritual significance for her people. It was one of the ancient birthing sites, places where Cherokee women had come for generations when they needed to give birth away from their communities, usually because the circumstances were unusual or dangerous. The walls bore the accumulated spiritual energy of countless successful births, and Ayana could feel the presence of ancestral mothers who had labored here before. "My name is Emily," the white woman said, her voice growing weaker. "Emily Patterson. This is my daughter. I don't know her name yet." Ayana knelt beside Emily, her practiced hands immediately beginning to assess the situation. "Names will come," she said gently. "First, we must ensure you both survive to use them." The medicine woman worked with swift efficiency, drawing on decades of experience with difficult births and emergency healing. From her medicine bag, she produced a sharp obsidian blade that had been blessed for sacred purposes. With careful, precise movements, she properly cut the umbilical cord, using herbs to prevent infection and bleeding. "The cord was not cut cleanly," Ayana explained as she worked. "This could cause problems, but we will fix it. Your body has done amazing work, but it needs help now." Emily watched in fascination as Ayana moved around the cave, seemingly transforming the chaotic birthing scene into something more organized and hopeful. The Cherokee woman built a small fire using materials she had brought with her, creating warmth and light that immediately began to chase away the deadly cold. She heated water in a metal cup, mixing it with herbs that filled the cave with a clean, medicinal scent. "How did you know to find me?" Emily asked as Ayana worked. "You said you had a vision." Ayana nodded, her attention focused on preparing a warm compress for Emily's torn tissues. "The spirits showed me a woman giving birth alone in this cave. They showed me the threads of fate that connect your life to my people's future. I do not yet understand all of what I saw, but I know that you and your daughter are meant to be part of something larger than this moment." The concept was difficult for Emily to process in her exhausted state, but she found herself trusting this strange woman who had appeared from the storm like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to voice. Ayana's hands were gentle but confident, her voice soothing despite the foreign accent that colored her English. "Your baby needs to be warmed," Ayana said, reaching for the tiny bundle. "May I?" Emily hesitated for only a moment before placing her daughter in Ayana's experienced hands. The Cherokee woman examined the baby with the thoroughness of someone who had delivered hundreds of children, checking breathing, reflexes, and signs of cold exposure. "She is small but strong," Ayana pronounced. "Born early but not dangerously so. Her spirit is fierce. She fought hard to enter this world." Using techniques passed down through generations of Cherokee midwives, Ayana began the process of warming the baby safely. She placed heated stones wrapped in soft cloth around the infant, creating a nest of warmth that would gradually raise her body temperature without shocking her system. She massaged the baby's tiny hands and feet, stimulating circulation and checking for signs of frostbite. "In my people's tradition," Ayana said as she worked, "children born in sacred places are considered to be touched by the spirits. This cave has seen the birth of many Cherokee children over the centuries. Your daughter has been born into a place of great power." Emily found herself oddly comforted by this information, even though it ran counter to everything her strict Christian upbringing had taught her about heathen beliefs and superstitions. There was something about Ayana's presence, her obvious competence and genuine care, that made Emily feel safer than she had in months. "Why are you helping us?" Emily asked quietly. "Your people, the Cherokee, white people, have not been kind to you." Ayana's hands stilled for a moment, and Emily saw something dark pass across her face. Old pain, old anger, old grief. But when the Cherokee woman spoke, her voice was steady and thoughtful. "My people have suffered greatly at the hands of white men," she said. "We have lost our lands, our homes, many of our children. We have been driven from places our ancestors considered sacred for 1,000 years. There is much anger in my heart about these things." She paused, gently adjusting the baby's position to ensure she was breathing comfortably. "But anger is not the only thing in my heart," Ayana continued. "I have also learned that the spirits work in ways we do not always understand. Sometimes they ask us to help those who have been our enemies. Sometimes they show us that healing can come from the most unexpected places." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, a combination of exhaustion, relief, and something deeper, a recognition that she was witnessing something profound and transformative. "The vision that brought me here showed me more than just your birth," Ayana said, her voice growing more contemplative. "I saw threads of connection between your daughter and my people. I saw possibilities for healing that could benefit everyone. I do not yet understand what the spirits are asking of us, but I know that helping you is the first step on a path that will change many lives." As if to punctuate her words, the baby began to stir, making soft sounds that indicated she was warming up and growing stronger. Ayana smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face and revealing the deep kindness that had motivated her dangerous journey through the storm. "She knows she's safe now," Ayana said. "Babies can sense when they are in the hands of those who will protect them. Your daughter feels the love of two mothers already." The words hit Emily with unexpected force. Two mothers. The concept was radical, even dangerous in the world she had known. But in this sacred cave, with storm winds howling outside and a Cherokee medicine woman working to save their lives, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Emily watched as Ayana continued her work, tending to both mother and child, with skills that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness. The bleeding had stopped, the baby was warm and breathing normally, and Emily herself was beginning to feel human again for the first time since the ordeal had begun. "What happens now?" Emily asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. Ayana looked up from her work, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight and something else, a depth of purpose that spoke of destinies being set in motion. "Now," she said simply, "we begin the real journey. The birth was just the beginning. What comes next will require courage from both of us and faith in things we cannot yet see." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the sacred cave, 3 lives had been forever intertwined by forces larger than any of them could fully comprehend. The storm finally began to break on the 3rd day, though Emily would later realize that those 3 days in the sacred cave had changed her more profoundly than the previous 22 years of her life combined. Under Ayana's expert care, Both she and her daughter had not only survived, but had begun to thrive in ways that seemed impossible given their circumstances. Ayana had proven to be far more than just a skilled healer. She was a teacher, a protector, and gradually something that felt remarkably like a friend. During the long hours while the blizzard raged outside, she had shared stories of Cherokee tradition, taught Emily songs to soothe the baby, and demonstrated techniques for nursing and childcare that had been passed down through generations of native mothers. "Your daughter has a strong spirit," Ayana observed on the morning when pale sunlight finally began to filter through the cave entrance. "She has not cried unnecessarily, she feeds well, and she looks at the world with eyes that see deeply. These are signs of an old soul, someone who has chosen to be born for a specific purpose." Emily had grown accustomed to Ayana's way of speaking about spiritual matters with the same matter-of-fact certainty that others might discuss the weather. At first, these concepts had been foreign and slightly unsettling to someone raised in strict Christian doctrine. But gradually, Emily had begun to appreciate the different perspective that Ayana's beliefs offered, a worldview that saw connections and meaning in events that her own culture might dismiss as mere coincidence. "I've been thinking about names," Emily said, gently rocking her daughter as the baby nursed. "In the white world, she would probably be called something like Margaret or Elizabeth, something proper and Christian. But after everything that's happened, those names don't feel right anymore." Ayana nodded thoughtfully. "Names carry power. They shape destiny and reflect the circumstances of birth. What does your heart tell you when you look at your daughter?" Emily studied the small face, now warm and healthy-looking after 3 days of proper care. The baby's eyes, when they opened, were a striking blue-green that seemed to shift color depending on the light. Her hair, now clean and dry, showed hints of auburn that caught the firelight like burnished copper. She was born in winter during the worst storm anyone could remember, Emily said slowly, but she survived. She fought to live when everything around us was trying to kill us. And somehow, in the darkest moment, help came from the most unexpected source. "Winter births are special to my people," Ayana said. "Children born during the cold season are believed to possess great endurance and the ability to find warmth, even in the harshest circumstances. We would call such a child Uwahi Gohusdi, winter fire." The name resonated with Emily in a way that surprised her. "Winter fire," she repeated, testing how it felt on her tongue. "It's beautiful. But what would that mean for her in the white world? How would she explain a Cherokee name?" "Perhaps," Ayana said carefully, "the question is not how she will explain it to the white world, but whether the white world is where she belongs." The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Emily wasn't quite ready to examine. But as she looked around the cave that had become their temporary home, she realized that the idea of returning to white society felt increasingly foreign and unwelcome. What awaited her there? Shame, poverty, and the constant struggle to hide her daughter's illegitimate birth. Even if she could find work and shelter, she would always be looking over her shoulder, waiting for someone to discover her secrets and destroy the fragile life she tried to build. Her daughter would grow up as an outcast, bearing the burden of circumstances beyond her control. "Tell me about your people," Emily said finally. "About where you live, how you survive. I need to understand what you're suggesting." Over the next several hours, as they prepared to leave the cave, Ayana painted a picture of life in Deep Valley that was both challenging and appealing. The Cherokee community there had created something unique, a place where traditional ways could be preserved while adapting to the realities of a changing world. "We are not wealthy in the way white people measure wealth," Ayana explained as she packed her healing supplies. "We do not have fine houses or many possessions, but we have something more valuable. we have each other. We have elders who remember the old stories, children who learn the traditional ways, and families who support each other through all difficulties. The community survived through a combination of hunting, farming, and careful trade with selected white merchants who could be trusted to keep their location secret. They raised corn, beans, and squash using ancient agricultural techniques, supplemented by game from the surrounding forests and fish from the mountain streams. "What about outsiders?" Emily asked. "Have other white people ever joined your community?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer carefully. "There have been a few over the years, traders who married Cherokee women and chose to stay, a missionary who learned our language and respected our ways, a doctor who helped us during a fever outbreak and earned our trust. But it is not common, and it is not easy." "What makes it difficult?" "Both sides have reasons for suspicion," Ayanna replied honestly. "My people have been betrayed by white promises too many times. We have learned to be careful about who we trust, and white people who choose to live with Indians face rejection from their own society. They must be willing to leave their old lives completely behind." Emily understood the magnitude of what was being suggested. To join Ayanna's community would mean abandoning not just her physical location, but her entire cultural identity. She would be crossing a line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. But as they prepared to leave the cave, Emily found herself thinking about what she would truly be leaving behind. A society that had no place for unmarried mothers. A culture that valued appearances over compassion. A world where her daughter would always be marked as illegitimate and shameful. The journey from the cave to Deep Valley took 2 days, following trails that seemed to exist more in Ayanna's memory than in any physical reality. The Cherokee woman moved through the mountain wilderness with an easy confidence that spoke of a lifetime spent in harmony with the natural world. Emily, still weak from childbirth but determined to keep up, found herself marveling at the way Ayanna navigated the terrain. The older woman seemed to read the landscape like a book, finding shelter when they needed rest, locating water sources, and avoiding the dangerous areas where snow might avalanche or ice might give way. "How do you know all of this?" Emily asked. During one of their rest stops, as she nursed winter fire, while Ayanna prepared a tea from plants she had gathered along the way. "My grandmother taught me to see the land as our ancestors saw it," Ayanna replied. "Every tree, every rock, every stream has a story to tell. When you learn to listen, the mountains themselves become your guides." The baby, whom Emily had decided to call both Winterfire and Catherine, honoring both cultures that would shape her life, seemed to thrive during the journey. She slept peacefully against Emily's chest as they walked, waking only to nurse before settling back into contentment. Satuma. The second evening, as they made camp in a sheltered grove of evergreens, Emily broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind throughout their journey. "If I come to your valley, if I try to join your people, what would be expected of me? How would I fit into your community?" Ayanna stirred the small fire they had built, her expression thoughtful. "That would depend on many things. The Council of Elders would need to meet and discuss your situation. Some would have concerns about bringing a white woman into our community. Others might see it as an opportunity for healing between our peoples. And you? What do you think?" "I think," Ayanna said slowly, "that the spirits do not send visions without purpose. I think your daughter was meant to be born in that sacred cave, and I was meant to find you there. I think there are forces at work larger than our individual fears and prejudices." She paused, studying Emily's face in the flickering firelight. "But I also think that joining our community would require more than just showing up and asking for sanctuary. You would need to prove your commitment, learn our ways, earn the trust and respect of people who have been given many reasons not to trust white promises." "How would I do that?" by becoming Cherokee not just in name, but in heart, by learning our language, our customs, our spiritual beliefs, by contributing to the community's welfare and putting the needs of the group above your own individual desires, by raising your daughter to understand and honor both sides of her heritage. Emily spent much of that night lying awake, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. Winterfire slept peacefully beside her, occasionally making the soft sounds of a contented baby. Nearby, Ayana breathed with the steady rhythm of someone at peace with her choices and her place in the world. By morning, Emily had made her decision. She couldn't return to the white world that had rejected her and offered no future for her. And daughter, she had to try to build something new, something better, something that honored the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them to this moment. When she told Ayana of her choice, the Cherokee woman nodded as if she had been expecting this answer. "The path will not be easy," Ayana warned. "There will be those in my community who question your motives, who test your resolve, who wait for you to give up and return to your own people. You will have to prove yourself again and again." "I understand," Emily replied, "but I have to try. For Winterfire's sake and for my own, I have to believe that there's a place in this world where we can belong." As they broke camp and began the final approach to Deep Valley, Emily felt a mixture of anticipation and terror that reminded her of the moments before Winterfire's birth. She was about to enter another kind of labor, the difficult process of being reborn into a new culture, a new identity, a new understanding of what family and community could mean. The mountains around them seemed to whisper with ancient voices, and Emily found herself hoping that those ancestral spirits would judge her worthy of the sanctuary she was seeking. The entrance to Deep Valley was so cunningly concealed that Emily would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing. What appeared to be a solid wall of rock and evergreen trees was actually an optical illusion created by the careful positioning of natural barriers. Only when Ayana led her through a narrow gap between two massive boulders did Emily realize they were entering a passage that wound deeper into the mountains. The hidden trail descended gradually for nearly a mile, following what must have once been a creek bed. Ancient Cherokee symbols had been carved into selected trees along the path, marks so subtle and weathered that only someone who knew what to look for would recognize their significance. Emily found herself marveling at the intelligence behind this concealment. No casual traveler, no government surveyor, no hostile force would stumble upon this community by accident. "My people have used this valley for 3 generations, Ayana explained as they walked. "Even before the forced removals, it served as a refuge for those who needed to disappear from the white world for a time. The mountains protect us, and our ancestors' spirits watch over the entrances." When they finally emerged from the passage into the valley itself, Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. Deep Valley was larger than she had expected, a hidden paradise nestled between towering peaks that rose like protective walls on all sides. A clear stream wound through the center of the valley, its banks lined with carefully tended gardens and fields. Scattered throughout the valley floor were traditional Cherokee dwellings, some built in the ancient style with bark and thatch, others showing adaptations to local materials and climate. But what struck Emily most powerfully was the sense of life and community that permeated the entire scene. Children played near the stream, while their mothers worked at various tasks. Men tended horses in a natural meadow that served as pasture. Smoke rose from multiple cooking fires, carrying the sense of unfamiliar but appetizing foods. Dogs barked in greeting as they approached, and Emily could hear the sound of voices speaking Cherokee, mixed with occasional English words. The arrival of Ayana and her unexpected companion did not go unnoticed. As they made their way into the heart of the settlement, People began to emerge from their dwellings and gather along their path. Emily felt dozens of eyes studying her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. She was acutely aware of how she must appear to these people, a bedraggled white woman carrying a newborn baby, obviously in need of help, but representing a culture that had brought immense suffering to the Cherokee people. Emily held Winterfire closer to her chest and tried to project confidence she didn't feel. "Ayanna!" A young woman's voice called out in English, and Emily saw a girl of perhaps 16 running toward them. This must be Morning Star, she realized, recognizing the adopted daughter Ayanna had mentioned during their journey. Morning Star was beautiful in the way that mixed heritage sometimes produced. She had the dark eyes and hair of her Cherokee ancestry, combined with features that suggested some European blood. She moved with the easy grace of someone completely at home in her environment, but Emily could see curiosity and concern in her expression as she approached. "You've been gone 3 days," Morningstar said, embracing Ayanna with obvious relief. "The storm was so bad we thought—" She trailed off as she noticed Emily and the baby, her eyes widening with surprise. "The spirits sent me to help this woman and her child," Ayanna explained simply. "They have been through a great ordeal, and they need our protection." Morningstar's gaze moved between Emily and the baby, and Emily saw the exact moment when the young woman understood the implications of what was being asked. A white woman and her newborn child seeking sanctuary among the Cherokee was not a simple matter of hospitality. It was a decision that could affect the safety and survival of the entire community. By now, a crowd had gathered around them. Emily found herself the center of attention from nearly 30 Cherokee men, women, and children, all studying her with expressions she couldn't read. She heard Cherokee words being spoken rapidly, and while she couldn't understand the language, she could sense the debate that was taking place about her presence. An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd, his bearing and the deference shown to him by others, marking him as a person of authority. He was tall for a Cherokee, with silver hair braided down his back and eyes that seemed to see everything. When he spoke, it was in English, but with a formality that suggested it was not his preferred language. "Ayanna Kingfisher," he said, his voice carrying the weight of leadership, "you have brought a white woman into our valley. This is a serious matter that requires explanation." "Yes, grandfather," Ayanna replied, using the term of respect for an elder rather than indicating family relationship. "I had a vision 3 nights ago. The spirits showed me this woman giving birth alone during the storm. They showed me that her fate and ours are connected in ways that will benefit our people." The elder's eyes moved to Emily, studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "What is your name, white woman? Why do you seek shelter among people your race has tried to destroy?" Emily swallowed hard, knowing that her next words would determine not just her immediate fate, but possibly the future of her daughter. "My name is Emily Patterson," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "This is my daughter, whom Ayanna has named Winterfire. We seek shelter because we have nowhere else to go, and because Ayanna saved our lives when we would have died alone." "Why do you have nowhere else to go?" the elder pressed. "What crime have you committed that your own people will not shelter you?" The blunt question forced Emily to confront the full truth of her situation in front of this gathering of strangers. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she knew that anything less than complete honesty would be both detected and rejected. "I am unmarried," she said quietly. "My daughter's father abandoned us when he learned of her existence. In the white world, this makes us outcasts. We face poverty, shame, and possibly violence if we remain among my people." Murmurs ran through the crowd at this admission. Emily caught some English words mixed with Cherokee: bastard child, white man's shame, no honor. She held Winterfire closer, feeling the protective fury that had sustained her through the worst moments of her ordeal. The elder raised his hand for silence. "I am Joseph Kingbird," he announced. "I serve as spokesman for the Council of Elders. In this community, your situation is unusual. We do not often have white people seeking to join our community, and never under circumstances like these." He paused, looking around at the faces of his people, reading expressions and gauging reactions. "However," he continued, "Ayanna Kingfisher is our most respected medicine woman. If she says the spirits have shown her a vision concerning you, we must consider this seriously, but visions must be tested against reality. Words must be proven by actions." Joseph Kingbird stepped closer to Emily, his weathered face showing neither kindness nor hostility, only the careful evaluation of someone making a decision that could affect many lives. "If you wish to remain in our valley, you must understand what you are asking," he said. "You are not requesting temporary shelter while you recover from your ordeal. You are asking to join our community, to become Cherokee in heart and mind, to raise your daughter as one of our children. This is not a decision to be made lightly by either side." Emily nodded, her throat too tight for speech. "You will be given a trial period," Joseph continued. "One full season, until the spring planting is complete. During this time, you will live among us and learn our ways. You will be taught our language, our customs, our responsibilities to the community. If, at the end of this period, both you and we are satisfied that you belong here, you will be formally adopted into our tribe. Your daughter will be raised as Cherokee, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But if you prove unsuitable, if you cannot adapt to our ways, if you cause discord in our community, if you betray our trust in any way, you will be asked to leave and never return. And you will be expected to keep the location of our valley secret for the rest of your life." The terms were both more generous and more demanding than Emily had expected. A full season to prove herself, but with the understanding that failure would mean permanent exile, not just from Deep Valley, but from any hope of Cherokee sanctuary. "I understand," Emily said, finding her voice again. "I accept your terms, and I'm grateful for the opportunity." Joseph Kingbird nodded slowly. "Very well. Ayanna, you will be responsible for this woman's education and conduct during the trial. Period. Morning Star will assist you. If she succeeds in becoming Cherokee, it will reflect well on your judgment. If she fails..." He left the consequences unspoken. The crowd began to disperse, but Emily could feel the weight of their continued scrutiny. She understood that every action, every word, every response would be evaluated and discussed. She was not just learning to live in a new community. She was auditioning for a role that would define the rest of her life and her daughter's future. Ayanna led Emily toward a small cabin near the center of the settlement. "You will stay with Morning Star and me during your trial period," she explained. "This will allow us to teach you properly and monitor your progress." As they walked, Emily noticed the details of daily life in Deep Valley that she had missed. During her first overwhelming impression, women worked at looms, creating textiles with patterns she didn't recognize. Men crafted tools and weapons using both traditional techniques and adaptations that incorporated metal obtained through trade. Children played games that seemed to combine Cherokee traditions with activities they might have learned from contact with white culture. "It's not what I expected," Emily admitted to Ayanna as they approached the cabin. "What did you expect?" Emily considered the question carefully. "I suppose I expected something more primitive. The way white people talk about Indian villages, I thought it would be more basic, less organized." Ayanna smiled, but there was sadness in her expression. "White people see what they want to see when they look at Cherokee life. They see only what is different from their own ways, not what is intelligent, efficient, or beautiful about our methods. As they reached the cabin, Morning Star opened the door with a welcoming gesture. "Come in," she said in English, then repeated the invitation in Cherokee. "You are safe here." Emily stepped across the threshold into her new life, carrying Winterfire into a world that was both completely foreign and somehow, mysteriously, beginning to feel like the home she had been searching for all her life. The real test was just beginning, but for the first time since Jonathan Wright's betrayal, Emily felt the possibility of a future that held promise instead of merely survival. Shiva, first week in Deep Valley, nearly broke Emily's resolve completely. Every aspect of daily life that she had taken for granted in the white world required relearning from the ground up. From the moment she woke each morning until she fell exhausted into her bed each night, Emily faced a constant barrage of new customs, unfamiliar languages, and social expectations that seemed impossible to master. The language barrier proved to be her greatest initial challenge. While many of the Cherokee in Deep Valley spoke some English, the daily life of the community was conducted primarily in Cherokee. Emily found herself isolated during conversations, dependent on Morning Star or Ayana to translate even the most basic interactions. "Show," Morning Star said on Emily's third morning, pointing to herself and speaking slowly. "Hello, now you try." Emily attempted to repeat the greeting, but her pronunciation was so far off that Morning Star winced. "Siyo," she corrected patiently. "The tones matter as much as the sounds. Cherokee is not like English. The way you say a word changes its meaning." Hours of language practice became a daily ritual. Morning Star, who had proven to be an unexpectedly gifted teacher, worked with Emily on basic vocabulary and sentence structure. But progress was frustratingly slow, and Emily often found herself struggling to communicate even simple needs. The situation became acutely embarrassing during a community meal on her fourth day in the valley. Emily had been invited to join the evening gathering, where families shared food and news from their daily activities. She sat quietly, holding Winterfire and trying to follow conversations that flowed too rapidly for her limited comprehension. When an elderly woman named Bluebird addressed her directly in Cherokee, Emily could only smile helplessly and look to Morning Star for translation. The woman's expression grew impatient, and she spoke again, more sharply this time. "She's asking about your daughter's father," Morning Star whispered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "She wants to know why he isn't here to support his child." Emily felt the weight of multiple gazes as the question was translated. The comfortable chatter of the gathering died away as people waited for her response. She understood that this was more than casual curiosity. It was a test of her honesty and her willingness to be vulnerable before the community. "Tell her," Emily said quietly, "that the father was a coward who abandoned us when he learned about the baby. Tell her that his family had already arranged another marriage for him, and he chose social position over honor." Morning Star translated, and Emily watched the faces around the circle as her words were shared. She saw a range of reactions, some sympathetic, others disapproving, still others thoughtful. Bluebird nodded slowly and made a comment that caused several people to murmur in agreement. "She says that Cherokee men do not abandon their children," Morning Star translated. "She says perhaps you are better off without such a man, but your daughter will need to learn what true strength looks like from Cherokee fathers." The comment stung, but Emily recognized the truth in it. Winterfire would indeed need male role models who demonstrated integrity and responsibility, qualities that Jonathan Wright had so conspicuously lacked. The daily routines of Cherokee life proved almost as challenging as the language. Emily had grown up with the structured schedules and specialized roles common in white society, where men and women had clearly defined spheres of activity. Cherokee life was more fluid, with roles that shifted based on seasonal needs and individual capabilities. Women in Deep Valley were expected to be competent in far more areas than Emily had ever imagined. They didn't just cook and clean, they were skilled farmers, craftspeople, traders, and decision-makers who contributed to the community's survival in dozens of ways. "Today, you learn to work with corn," announced Gentle Rain, a woman in her 40s, who had been assigned to teach Emily agricultural skills. "Corn is life for Cherokee people. If you cannot grow corn, dry corn, store corn, and prepare corn in 20 different ways, you cannot survive here." Emily followed Gentle Rain to the community's main cornfield, where several women were working, to harvest the late fall crop. The work was backbreaking, hours of bending, cutting, and hauling heavy baskets of corn. Emily's soft hands, accustomed to the genteel work of a schoolteacher, were soon bleeding from blisters. "You are weak," observed Singing Wolf, a woman whose disapproval of Emily's presence had been obvious from the beginning. "White women do not know real work. They sit in houses while their slaves do everything for them." Emily wanted to protest, that she had never owned slaves, that her own family had been poor, that she understood hard work, but her bleeding hands and aching back made any defense seem hollow. She was weak by Cherokee standards, and complaining about it would only confirm their worst assumptions about white women. The learning curve extended to every aspect of daily life. Cherokee cooking methods, food preservation techniques, and even eating customs were all foreign to Emily. She burned her first attempts at making cornbread over an open fire. She ruined a perfectly good deer hide by failing to properly prepare it for tanning. She inadvertently violated social protocols by speaking when she should have listened, by standing when she should have sat, by looking directly at elders when respect required lowered eyes. Each mistake became a community discussion. Emily could sense the debates that occurred when she wasn't present, discussions about whether she was truly committed to learning Cherokee ways or simply taking advantage of their hospitality while planning an eventual return to white society. The situation reached a crisis point during her second week in the valley. Emily had been struggling with a particularly difficult weaving pattern under the instruction of Silver Moon, an elderly woman renowned for her textile artistry. The work required a level of fine motor control and pattern recognition that Emily simply hadn't developed, and after hours of frustration, she finally threw down the shuttle in defeat. "I can't do this," she said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and disappointment. "I can't learn fast enough. I can't become Cherokee in one season." Maybe this was all a mistake. Silver Moon studied Emily with sharp eyes that seemed to see directly into her soul. When she spoke, it was in slow, carefully pronounced English. "Cherokee babies do not learn to walk in one day," she said. "They fall down many times, but they keep trying because walking is necessary for life. You think becoming Cherokee should be easier than learning to walk?" The simple analogy hit Emily with unexpected force. She had been approaching her education with the impatience of someone accustomed to quick success in academic subjects, not understanding that cultural transformation was more like physical development, something that required time, repetition, and the willingness to fail repeatedly before achieving competence. "Show me again," Emily said quietly, picking up the shuttle. "I want to learn." Silver Moon's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Good. Now watch carefully. See how the pattern emerges from patience, not speed." The breakthrough came gradually. Over the following days, Emily began to accept that progress would be measured in small increments rather than dramatic leaps. She developed calluses on her hands from corn husking and hide working. She learned to recognize the subtle differences. in Cherokee pronunciation that distinguished one word from another. She began to anticipate the rhythms of daily life in Deep Valley, understanding when to participate and when to observe. Most importantly, she began to understand Winter Fire's place in all of this. The baby was thriving under the communal care that Cherokee culture provided. Different women in the community took turns holding her, singing to her, and teaching her the Cherokee lullabies that would be among her first remembered sounds. Emily watched in amazement as elderly men who had initially been suspicious of her presence melted completely when Winter Fire was placed in their arms. "She belongs here in a way that I'm still struggling to achieve," Emily confided to Ayanna during one of their evening conversations. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm holding her back by trying to bridge both worlds." "Every child needs to understand all the parts of their heritage," Ayanna replied thoughtfully. "Winter Fire will always be part white, just as she will always be part Cherokee through her birth in the sacred cave and her adoption by our community. Your job is to make sure she understands the value of both traditions." As autumn deepened into winter, Emily found herself settling into routines that felt increasingly natural. She began to dream in fragments of Cherokee words. She could identify community members by their footsteps and voices. She understood the subtle social cues that governed interaction between different age groups and family relationships. The real test came during her 6th week in Deep Valley, when a group of Cherokee hunters returned from a successful deer hunt. The celebration that followed would determine whether Emily had learned enough about Cherokee customs to participate meaningfully in community life, or whether she was still an outsider, observing from the margins. "Tonight you will help prepare the feast," Morningstar announced. "But you must do it correctly. If you make mistakes with ceremonial food preparation, it will be seen as disrespect for the hunters and the animals that gave their lives for our survival." Emily felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Another test, another opportunity to fail publicly. But as she looked around at the busy preparations, she realized something had changed. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of Cherokee customs, she found herself eager to contribute, to prove that she had learned enough to be trusted with important responsibilities. "Tell me what I need to do," she said firmly. "I'm ready." Morningstar smiled, and for the first time since Emily's arrival, there was genuine warmth in her expression rather than cautious politeness. "Yes," she said simply. "I think you are." The feast preparation would test everything Emily had learned about Cherokee culture, but more than that, it would test her commitment to becoming the person she claimed she wanted to be. As she rolled up her sleeves and joined the other women in their work, Emily felt the first stirrings of confidence that maybe, just maybe, she was strong enough to complete the transformation she had begun. The deer hunt had been the most successful. In 3 years, bringing in enough meat to sustain the community through the harsh winter months ahead. But more than just food, the hunt represented the continuation of ancient traditions that connected the Cherokee people to their ancestors and to the land that sustained them. The feast that would follow was not merely a celebration. It was a sacred ceremony that honored the spirits of the animals, the skill of the hunters, and the bonds that held the community together. Emily understood that her role in preparing this feast would be scrutinized more carefully than anything she had done since arriving in Deep Valley. The women who had been teaching her various skills would be watching to see if she had truly absorbed the lessons, or if she was merely going through the motions without understanding their deeper significance. "The preparation of ceremonial food is not just cooking," explained Gentle Rain, as they gathered in the large communal kitchen that served the entire community during important celebrations. Every cut of the knife, every mixture of ingredients, Every prayer spoken over the food carries meaning. You must work with intention, not just technique. Emily nodded, trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building since dawn. Around her, a dozen Cherokee women moved with practiced efficiency, each taking responsibility for different aspects of the feast preparation. The atmosphere was both festive and reverent, filled with conversation and laughter, but underlaid with the serious purpose of honoring tradition. "You will work with me on the succotash," announced Bluebird, the elderly woman who had questioned Emily so sharply during her first community meal. "This is not white man's succotash with milk and butter. This is Cherokee succotash, made the way our grandmothers made it, with corn and beans and squash that have been blessed by our ceremonies." Emily felt a flutter of nervousness. Bluebird had remained one of her most skeptical critics, often making pointed comments about white women's inability to understand Cherokee ways. Being chosen to work directly with her felt like walking into a test she might not be prepared to pass. The work began before sunrise, with Emily helping to prepare the three sacred sisters, corn, beans, and squash, that formed the foundation of Cherokee agriculture and cuisine. Each ingredient required specific handling, with prayers offered at crucial moments and particular attention paid to the spiritual significance of combining foods that had been grown together in harmony. "Watch how I cut the squash," Bluebird instructed, her weathered hands moving with surprising dexterity. "See how I remove the seeds but keep them separate? Nothing is wasted in Cherokee cooking. The seeds will be dried and saved for next year's planting, and some will be roasted for eating." Emily mimicked Bluebird's movements, trying to match not just the technique, but the reverent attitude that the older woman brought to even the most mundane tasks. She was beginning to understand that Cherokee culture found sacred meaning in activities that white society often viewed as merely utilitarian. As the morning progressed, Emily found herself working alongside women who had initially viewed her with suspicion, but who were gradually beginning to accept her presence. Singing Wolf, who had criticized Emily's weakness during corn harvesting, now worked beside her in companionable silence, occasionally offering corrections to her technique, but without the harsh judgment that had characterized their earlier interactions. "Your hands are stronger now," Singing Wolf observed, as Emily efficiently cleaned a pile of freshly harvested beans. "And your movements show more understanding. You begin to work like Cherokee woman, not like white woman pretending to be Cherokee." The comment, meant as a compliment, revealed how carefully Emily's progress had been monitored. Every skill she had struggled to learn, every small improvement in her technique had been noted and discussed within the community. The realization was both humbling and encouraging. Humbling because it confirmed how thoroughly she had been under scrutiny. Encouraging because it suggested that her efforts were being recognized. The most challenging aspect of the feast preparation was the ceremonial bread that would accompany the main dishes. Cherokee bread making involved techniques that were completely foreign to Emily's experience, using ingredients and methods that had been passed down through generations of Cherokee women. "This bread connects us to our ancestors," explained Silver Moon as she guided Emily through the complex process. "Every woman in our community learned to make this bread from their mothers and grandmothers. Now you must learn it too, because your daughter will need to learn it from you." The thought of Winterfire someday learning Cherokee traditions from her mother added weight to every step of the process. Emily found herself concentrating with an intensity that surprised her, determined not just to complete the task correctly, but to internalize it so thoroughly that she could pass it on to the next generation. As the day wore on, the kitchen filled with the aromas of traditional Cherokee cooking, the earthy smell of corn being ground by hand, the rich scent of venison being prepared with wild herbs, the sweet fragrance of ceremonial bread baking in clay ovens that had been built using ancient techniques. But the food preparation was only part of the day's activities. Throughout the settlement, other preparations were taking place that would transform the evening's gathering into a true celebration of community and tradition. Men were preparing the ceremonial fire that would burn throughout the feast, using specific types of wood that had been selected for their spiritual significance. Children were practicing songs and dances that would honor the hunters and the animals that had given their lives for the community's survival. Emily caught glimpses of these other preparations as she moved between different workstations, and she began to understand the complexity of what was being orchestrated. The feast was not just a meal, but a carefully choreographed ceremony that would reinforce the bonds between community members and connect them to the spiritual traditions that gave their lives meaning. As afternoon faded into evening, the preparation reached its climactic phase. The various dishes were completed and arranged according to traditional protocols, with specific foods placed in positions that reflected their ceremonial importance. Emily found herself trusted with increasingly important tasks, arranging sacred items on the serving tables, helping to prepare the ritual cleansing water that would be used before the feast began, even assisting in the final blessing of the food. "You have done well today," Ayana said quietly as they worked together to arrange the last of the ceremonial items. "I have watched you throughout the day, and I see that you are beginning to understand not just what we do, but why we do it." Emily felt a flush of pride at the praise, but also a deep sense of responsibility. She was beginning to understand that becoming Cherokee was not just about learning new skills or adopting different customs. It was about embracing a completely different way of seeing the world, one that found spiritual significance in daily activities and that prioritized community welfare over individual desires. As the sun set behind the mountains that protected Deep Valley, the community began to gather for the feast. Emily watched in fascination as families arrived in their finest traditional clothing, with intricate beadwork and carved ornaments that reflected both artistic skill and cultural pride. Children ran excitedly between the adults, their voices adding to the festive atmosphere. The ceremony began with the lighting of the sacred fire, accompanied by prayers offered in Cherokee by Joseph Kingbird and other elders. Emily couldn't understand all the words, but she could feel the weight of tradition and reverence that filled the air. These were prayers that had been spoken by Cherokee people for centuries, connecting the present celebration to countless similar gatherings stretching back into the mists of time. When the time came to serve the food, Emily found herself called forward to help distribute the dishes she had spent all day preparing. It was a moment of profound significance. She was not just being allowed to observe Cherokee customs, but was being trusted to participate in one of their most important ceremonial functions. As she moved among the gathered families, offering food and receiving thanks in Cherokee words she was beginning to understand, Emily felt something shift inside her. For the first time since arriving in Deep Valley, she felt like she belonged here not as a guest or a charity case, but as a contributing member of the community. The feast itself was a revelation. Emily had expected the meal to be served quickly and consumed in the casual manner of white society gatherings. Instead, she discovered that Cherokee feasting was a deliberate, ceremonial process where each dish was presented with explanations of its significance and where eating was interspersed with stories, songs, and expressions of gratitude. When winter fire began to fuss during the meal, Emily was surprised to see several Cherokee women immediately offer to help. But more than just practical assistance, they began to include the baby in the ceremonial aspects of the feast, speaking to her in Cherokee and introducing her to the community as if she were already a full member rather than a newcomer. "Your daughter has been accepted by the spirits of this place," observed Joseph Kingbird as he held winter fire during one of the ceremonial songs. See how peacefully she rests during our sacred songs. She recognizes the voices of her Cherokee family. As the evening progressed and the feast moved into its final phases, Emily realized that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with the community. The suspicious glances and skeptical comments that had characterized her first weeks in Deep Valley had been replaced by something approaching acceptance. She was still obviously a newcomer with much to learn, but she was no longer viewed as an intruder or a potential threat. The celebration continued long into the night, with storytelling and traditional dances that Emily watched with growing appreciation for the richness of Cherokee culture. When she finally returned to Ayana's cabin in the early hours of the morning, carrying a sleeping winter fire and feeling exhausted but exhilarated, Emily knew that she had crossed an important threshold in her journey toward becoming Cherokee. "Today was good," Ayana said simply as they prepared for sleep. "The community saw that you can work alongside Cherokee women as an equal, not as someone who needs constant supervision. This is an important step toward acceptance." As Emily settled into her bed with winter fire sleeping peacefully beside her, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying night in the cave when she'd given birth alone and desperate. The journey from that moment of despair to this evening of celebration had been more challenging than anything she had ever experienced, but it had also been more rewarding than she had dared to hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself worthy of the trust the Cherokee people were beginning to place in her. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in Deep Valley, Emily fell asleep feeling truly hopeful about the future she was building for herself and her daughter in this remarkable community that was slowly becoming home. Spring came to Deep Valley with an explosion of life that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place in Emily's own existence. After 6 months of winter isolation, learning and gradual acceptance, the warming air carried more than just the promise of new growth. It carried the anticipation of a ceremony that would either complete Emily's journey into Cherokee identity or mark the end of her time in the hidden valley. The mountain laurel bloomed in cascades of pink and white along the valley walls, and the stream that wound through the settlement ran high and clear with snowmelt from the peaks above. Emily found herself drinking in these sights with an appreciation that had deepened throughout her months of learning to see the world through Cherokee eyes. Every flower, every budding tree, every shift in the wind carried meaning that she was finally beginning to understand. Winter Fire, now 6 months old, had grown into a remarkably alert and healthy baby who seemed to embody the best of both worlds. She would inherit. Her eyes had settled into a striking blue-green that shifted color with her moods and the light around her, and her hair showed the auburn highlights that caught fire in the morning sun. More than her physical beauty, though, was the way she responded to the Cherokee world around her, calming instantly when the elders sang traditional songs, reaching eagerly for the carved toys that community members had made for her, and showing an uncanny ability to sense the emotional currents that flowed through gatherings. "Your daughter dreams in Cherokee," Ayana observed one morning as they watched Winter Fire sleep peacefully despite the busy preparations happening around her. "See how she moves her hands when she sleeps? She is dancing to the songs she hears in her spirit world." The observation filled Emily with a complex mixture of pride and trepidation. Winter Fire's easy acceptance into Cherokee culture was a blessing, but it also represented a responsibility that weighed heavily on Emily's shoulders. She was raising a child who would need to navigate multiple worlds, and Emily herself was still learning what that would require. The spring planting season had been chosen deliberately as the time for Emily's final evaluation. If she was to become truly Cherokee, she needed to demonstrate not just her ability to perform individual tasks, but her understanding of the intricate relationships that bound the community together through the cycles of the agricultural year. "Today begins the most important test," Joseph Kingbird announced, as the community gathered at dawn on the first day of planting. "We will see if Emily Patterson has learned to think like Cherokee woman, to work like Cherokee woman, to place the needs of the community above her own desires like Cherokee woman." The weight of his words settled over Emily like a mantle she was finally ready to wear. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified by such expectations. Now, she felt a quiet confidence that surprised her with its strength. She had worked too hard, learned too much, and invested too deeply in this community to fail now. The planting ceremony began with prayers offered to the spirits of the earth, asking for their blessing on the seeds that would sustain the community through the coming year. Emily had learned enough Cherokee by now to understand not just the words, but the deeper spiritual concepts they expressed. She found herself genuinely moved by the recognition of humanity's dependence on forces beyond their control and the humble gratitude that characterized Cherokee relationship with the natural world. "Galvkodiu duyuktuv," she whispered along with the others, offering her own prayer for the success of the planting. The Cherokee words felt natural on her tongue now, no longer foreign sounds she struggled to imitate, but expressions of thoughts and feelings that had become part of her inner landscape. But understanding the prayers was only the beginning. As the community moved into the fields to begin the actual planting, Emily discovered that she was expected to take a leadership role in organizing the work. This was not something that had been discussed in advance. It was a test of her ability to read the community's needs and respond appropriately without explicit instruction. The moment of realization brought a flash of the old panic, the familiar fear of failure that had haunted her throughout her early days in Deep Valley. But as Emily looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family, she felt that fear transform into determination. These people had invested months in teaching her, supporting her, and believing in her potential. She would not let them down. "The corn must be planted in the traditional pattern," explained Gentle Rain, but instead of giving detailed instructions, she stepped back and waited to see if Emily had absorbed enough Cherokee agricultural knowledge to proceed correctly. Emily felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her, but instead of feeling intimidated, she drew upon the confidence that months of successful learning had built within her. She had learned to trust, not just her conscious knowledge, but the deeper understanding that came from living Cherokee life day by day. "The 3 sisters need to be planted together," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak. "Corn first, in the sacred pattern that honors the 4 directions and creates space for the spirits to move among the plants. Then beans, which will climb the corn stalks and add nutrients to the soil through their roots. Finally, squash, which will spread between the rows and keep the weeds away while providing food and materials for the community." She moved through the field with growing confidence, directing the placement of each crop with an understanding that went beyond mere technique. Emily had learned to see the agricultural system as Cherokee people saw it, not as a human imposition on the land, but as a partnership between people and plants that required wisdom, respect, and careful attention to natural rhythms. As she worked, Emily found herself thinking in Cherokee concepts that had no direct English equivalents. The idea of duyuktuvi, the right relationship between all living things, guided her decisions about where to place each plant. The concept of gadugi, cooperative spirit that put community welfare above individual gain, shaped how she assigned tasks and resolved disagreements among the workers. "See how she moves through the field," observed Bluebird to a group of women who were watching Emily's leadership. "She does not rush to show her knowledge, but she does not hesitate when decisions must be made. This is the balance of wisdom that Cherokee women must possess. As the day progressed, Emily encountered challenges that tested not just her agricultural knowledge, but her understanding of Cherokee social dynamics. When a dispute arose between two families about the best location for their respective plots, Emily found herself mediating between competing interests with skills she had never consciously developed. "Both families have wisdom to share," she said diplomatically, drawing upon Cherokee values of respect for different perspectives. Swift Deer's family knows the patterns of water flow from years of observation. Running Bear's family understands the soil conditions from their success in previous years. Perhaps we can combine both types of knowledge to find a solution that serves everyone. The compromise she suggested, adjusting the plot boundaries to give each family access to both good drainage and rich soil, satisfied both parties and demonstrated the kind of practical wisdom that Cherokee culture valued highly. When younger workers grew tired or discouraged as the day wore on, Emily found ways to encourage them that drew upon traditional Cherokee values of persistence and communal support. She shared stories she had learned from the elders about previous planting seasons, sang work songs that helped maintain rhythm and energy, and made sure that the heaviest tasks were distributed fairly among those capable of handling them. Most importantly, she demonstrated the kind of selfless commitment that Cherokee culture valued above individual achievement. When her own section of the field was completed ahead of schedule, Emily immediately moved to help others who were struggling, putting the success of the community's planting above any personal recognition or rest. "She works like someone who understands that her family's survival depends on this harvest," observed Singing Wolf, who had become one of Emily's most vocal supporters after initially opposing her presence in the community. More than that, she works like someone who knows that the survival of Cherokee culture depends on young people learning to think like Cherokee people. The compliment carried special weight because it came from someone whose initial skepticism had been overcome through observation of Emily's genuine commitment to Cherokee values. Singing Wolf's approval meant that even the most cautious members of the community were beginning to accept Emily as truly one of their own. By the end of the planting season, which stretched over several weeks as different crops were sown, according to traditional timing, it was clear that Emily had passed this crucial test. She had demonstrated not just competence in Cherokee agricultural methods, but the kind of leadership and community spirit that marked her as someone who could be trusted with the welfare of the entire group. But the final determination of her status would not be made by her practical performance alone. The decision would ultimately rest with the Council of Elders, who would evaluate not just her skills, but her character, her commitment, and her understanding of what it truly meant to be Cherokee in a world that was increasingly hostile to Cherokee survival. The formal evaluation took place on a warm evening in late spring, when the planted fields were already showing the first green shoots of new growth, and the valley was alive with the sounds of birds and insects celebrating the return of warmth to the mountains. The entire community gathered in the ceremonial circle at the heart of Deep Valley, with Emily and Winterfire seated in the center, facing the 7 members of the Council of Elders. The ceremony began at sunset, with the lighting of the sacred fire that had burned during every important Cherokee gathering for generations. Emily watched the flames spring to life and felt the weight of tradition settling around her like a cloak. This fire connected her to countless Cherokee ceremonies stretching back through time, and tonight it would witness her transformation from outsider to family member. Joseph Kingbird spoke first, his words carrying the weight of tradition and the gravity of the decision being made. 6 months ago, a white woman came to our valley seeking shelter for herself and her newborn daughter. We agreed to test whether She could become Cherokee not just in name, but in heart and spirit. Tonight, we complete that evaluation and determine her place among our people. He paused, looking around at the faces of the community members who would be affected by whatever decision was reached. Emily could see the genuine affection and respect that had developed over the months of shared work and daily interaction, but she also understood that emotions alone would not determine the outcome. Cherokee culture demanded practical evidence of commitment and capability. We have watched Emily Patterson work alongside our women, learn our language, participate in our ceremonies, and care for our children as if they were her own. We have seen her put the needs of our community above her personal comfort, accept criticism without anger, and persist in learning even when the tasks seemed impossible. Emily held her breath, aware that her entire future and Winter Fire's future hung on the words about to be spoken. In her arms, the baby slept peacefully, as if sensing that this was a moment for quietness and reverence. But becoming Cherokee requires more than just learning our customs, Joseph continued, his voice growing more serious. It requires understanding the spiritual responsibilities that connect us to our ancestors, to the land, and to each other. It requires being willing to sacrifice everything for the good of the people, and to raise children who will carry our traditions into the future, even when the outside world tries to destroy what we have preserved. Another elder, a woman named Grandmother Willow, whose age and wisdom commanded universal respect, rose to speak. This woman came to us carrying shame from the white world, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. But she has transformed that shame into strength, turned her pain into understanding, made her suffering into medicine that can heal others who face similar challenges. This is the Cherokee way, to find purpose in pain, to create beauty from brokenness. She gestured toward Winter Fire, sleeping contentedly in Emily's arms. And this child, born in our sacred cave during the season of death and cold, has brought new life to our community. The elders dream of her future, and we see a bridge between worlds, someone who will help Cherokee people survive in the changing times ahead while keeping our traditions alive in her heart. Emily felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she sensed the direction of the evaluation, but she forced herself to remain composed. This was too important a moment for emotional displays that might be misinterpreted as weakness or manipulation. Joseph Kingbird rose again, his expression solemn but warm. During your time with us, you have demonstrated the qualities that define Cherokee womanhood. You have shown that you understand the sacred nature of the work we do, the prayers we offer, and the relationships we maintain with the spirits of this place. You have proven that you can be trusted with our most important responsibilities and our deepest secrets. He turned to address Emily directly, his words carrying the formality of ancient ritual. You have learned to speak our language not just with your mouth but with your heart. You have learned to work our land not just with your hands but with respect for the spirits that dwell in every seed and stone. You have learned to live among our people, not just as a guest, but as a daughter who shares our burdens and our joys. The tribal leader stood, and the entire community rose with him in a gesture of respect and anticipation. Most importantly, Joseph said, his voice growing warmer with genuine affection, you have shown us that your daughter, born in our sacred cave and raised among our people, belongs here as completely as any child born to Cherokee parents. Winter Fire is Cherokee in every way that matters, and she will grow up to strengthen our community with her unique gifts and her ability to walk in multiple worlds. Emily felt her heart racing as the moment of final decision approached. Everything she had worked for, everything she had hoped for, hung on the next words to be spoken. Therefore, by the authority vested in me by the Council of Elders, and with the unanimous approval of this community, I declare that Emily Patterson has completed her transformation from white woman to Cherokee daughter. From this day forward, she will be known as Atsila Selu, Firecorn, in recognition of her daughter's birth during the winter storm and her own growth into a woman who can nurture our people's future through the seasons of plenty and the seasons of struggle. The new name struck Emily with profound emotional force. She was no longer Emily Patterson, the desperate woman who had fled into the mountains carrying shame and fear. She was Atsila Selu, a Cherokee woman with a place in the community and a role in preserving traditions that stretched back through countless generations. "And your daughter," Joseph continued, his voice filled with joy and ceremonial gravity, "will be known as Uwahi Gohusdi Atsila, Winter Fireflower, honoring both the circumstances of her birth in the sacred cave and the beauty she brings to our community as a bridge between the world of our ancestors and the world our children will inherit." The naming ceremony that followed was unlike anything Emily, now Atsila Selu, had ever experienced. As community members came forward to offer blessings and gifts to the newly named Cherokee family, she felt herself being welcomed not just as an individual but as part of a living tradition that would continue long after she was gone. Each gift carried meaning that went far beyond its material value. Ayana presented her with a bundle wrapped in traditional Cherokee cloth, revealing a beautifully carved wooden cradle decorated with symbols that told the story of Cherokee motherhood. "This belonged to my grandmother," Ayana explained, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. "She told me to save it for the daughter who would need it most. I believe Winter Fire is that daughter, and you are the mother who will teach her to honor the ancestors who carved this cradle with their love." As Atsila Selu accepted the gift, she understood that she was receiving more than just a beautiful object. She was being entrusted with a piece of Cherokee heritage, a tangible connection to the ancestors who had guided her journey from the moment Ayana had received her vision in the darkness before dawn. Other gifts followed: traditional clothing, sized for both mother and daughter, tools for the traditional crafts that Atsila Selu would be expected to master and teach, sacred items that would help her maintain spiritual connections to Cherokee beliefs and practices. Each offering represented not just generosity but trust, evidence that the community was fully committed to welcoming these newest members into the circle of Cherokee life. The celebration continued late into the night, with traditional dances and songs that welcomed the newest members of the Cherokee family. Atsila Selu participated in these ceremonies not as an observer, but as a full member of the community, someone whose voice was valued and whose contributions were recognized as essential to the group's survival and prosperity. When Winter Fire woke during the festivities, she was passed from hand to hand among the Cherokee families, each person offering blessings in their ancient language and welcoming her as their own granddaughter, niece, or sister. The baby seemed to thrive on the attention, gurgling happily and reaching for the faces that surrounded her with love and acceptance. As the evening drew to a close and families began to return to their homes, Atsila Selu found herself standing, with Ayana at the edge of the ceremonial circle, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain air. "Do you ever regret the path that brought you here?" Ayana asked quietly, her words carrying the weight of someone who understood the cost of transformation. Atsila Selu considered the question carefully, thinking of all the pain and fear that had driven her into the mountains, all the struggles she had endured to transform herself into someone worthy of Cherokee acceptance. "I regret the circumstances that made the journey necessary," she said finally, her voice steady with hard-won wisdom. "I regret the betrayal and abandonment that forced me to flee, The shame that nearly destroyed me, the fear that drove me into that cave to give birth alone. But I don't regret where that journey led. I don't regret finding you in that sacred place, or learning to see the world through Cherokee eyes, or discovering that family can be created through choice and commitment as well as blood. She looked down at Winterfire, now sleeping peacefully in the ancestral cradle, surrounded by the love and protection of an entire community that had chosen to claim them both as their own. Most of all, I don't regret giving my daughter a heritage that will make her strong, a culture that will teach her to find meaning in everything she does, and a family that will support her no matter what challenges the changing world brings to Cherokee people. As they walked back toward the cabin that had become Atsila Selu's true home, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from the courthouse steps of a hostile white town to the heart of a Cherokee community that had embraced her completely. The woman who had once given birth alone in a cave during a blizzard had become the mother who would raise her daughter to bridge two worlds, honoring both the Cherokee traditions that had saved them and the broader heritage that would always be part of their story. In Deep Valley, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed her transformation and protected by the community that had become her family, Atsila Selu looked toward a future bright with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The blizzard that had once threatened to destroy her had instead delivered her to exactly where she belonged, home at last in every sense of the word that mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.